Is DNA valid evidence in Halachah?
DNA is used in the secular courts in many cases. It's used by the police departments at a crime scene to determine who committed the crime. It's used in courts to determine who is the parent of a child. Do they need to pay alimony, child support? And the question is, does Halachah recognize DNA? In what cases would Halachah use these cases? First of all, in similar cases as the secular courts, but also in a case of agunas. Unfortunately, after 9/11, there were women who came to the Beis Din who says that their husbands were working in the Twin Towers. Unfortunately, their bodies were not found. So the question is, would Halachah use DNA to matter these women? There's also been a recent discovery that there's a specific gene, a specific DNA for Kohanim that only passes through the father. So would Halachah use DNA to determine that this is the father of a certain child? So in general, we find in Sefer Chasidim a story with Rabbi Gaon. And the story is about a fellow who, his wife was pregnant, and he went on a business trip with his servant. Unfortunately, on his trip, he died. During his trip, he passed away. And his servant, pretending to be his son, took over all his wealth that he had with him on his trip. Meanwhile, his wife, who was at home, gave birth to a baby boy. And many years later, this son found out that there is a man parading as the descendant, the child of this person. So this son brought this servant to Reb Sadia Gaon's court and asked him to paskin the case. He said, I'm the real son, and this servant is not the real son. He's just parading as the son. And Reb Sadia Gaon said as follows: each person, we should draw blood from each of them. We should draw blood from the son, and we should draw blood from the servants. And they put the blood into two separate bowls. And Reb Sadia Gaon said they should retrieve one bone from the father's grave. And whichever blood the bone would absorb, we know that's the real child's. They put the bone into the bowl with the servant's blood, and it didn't absorb the blood. They put the bone into the bowl with the son's blood, and it was absorbed. And Reb Sadia Gaon says, this proves that he is the son. So we see this ancient technique of blood test, sort of to try to determine who is the actual son. And based on this story in Sefer Chassidim, many poskim discuss would Halachah accept DNA. In general, the consensus amongst the poskim is that Halachah does recognize and does accept DNA, that it's a good enough proof to prove in certain cases. For example, in the case of Aguna by 9/11, 8 out of the 11 women who came to Beis Din, the Beis Din were mater them to remarry through the DNA that proved that their husbands were killed in the terrorist attack. In Eretz Yisrael, this is also commonly used. Unfortunately, during the battle and after a terrorist attack, if the body is not available, they cannot retrieve the body. They do use DNA. The Beis Din does use DNA to be mater the family in order that they should be able to sit shiva, avelis, and in case of agunas, to remarry. There are 2 cases where the Chachamim are very machmer and we do not accept DNA, and these cases are whether a person is a mamzer or not. Halachah is very strict about this, and we do not accept DNA in this case, as well as a case between a husband and wife to be usher, a wife to her husband. We also are machmer and we do not accept DNA. Now, what's interesting is about a kohen. Would we use the DNA of someone who has the DNA of a kohen, which, as we mentioned, is only passed through the father? Would we use that to prove that he's a kohen? So here's the interesting thing. In order for someone to be considered a kohen, the Torah says it passes through the father. However, in order for someone to be considered Jewish, it passes through the mother. So you can have a person who has the genes, the DNA of a kohen from his father, but if his mother isn't Jewish, then not only is he not a kohen, he's not even Jewish. However, if we know that someone is Jewish, and he has the DNA of a kohen, it is very likely that we would possibly consider this person a kohen. It's a great possibility that he would be considered a kohen. However, it's difficult to know because you sort of need to go back to make sure that every single person in his lineage who had this DNA and shared this DNA was also 100% Jewish.